November 14, 1942. The morning fog had not yet lifted from the WWII forest when a German signals officer named Lieutenant Franz Richter climbed down from his motorcycle and stared at the road ahead in stunned silence. Before him lay what remained of a Wehrmacht supply column, 3 Opel wagon staff car, and the motorcycle courier. They were not burning, they were not overturned, they were simply stopped, arranged in a loose curve along the forest track, as though their drivers had gently pulled over and stepped out for a walk. Except that none of the drivers had walked anywhere. They were gone. Every man, 14 soldiers in total, had vanished from the vehicles without a trace of blood, struggle, or any sign of an enemy attack. The cargo was untouched. Cases of winter ammunition sat neatly stacked in the back of the second truck. A locked metal box of payroll documents rested undisturbed behind the passenger seat of the staff car. Even the fuel was still in the tanks. Richter walked the length of the column twice. He checked the tree line. He called out. Nothing answered him but the wind moving through the ancient pines. He filed his report that afternoon. His commanding officer read it once, set it down, and read it again. Then he summoned the garrison at Hachnoka and ordered a search of the surrounding 12 kilometers of forest. The search found nothing. Not a boot print, not a shell casing, not a single thread of clothing belonging to any of the 14 missing men. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to the story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. The mystery was filed under the German military designation Ungeklärter Vorfall Unexplained Incident. But within the hushed farmhouses and frozen cellars of the villages along the forest's edge, a different kind of story was already beginning to spread. The locals did not call it unexplained. They called it the work of the Leshy, the old Slavic spirit of the forest. But those who were paying closer attention, those who had eyes trained to see what the Germans could not, called it something else entirely. They called it Alexander. The forest road that ran between the garrison town of Hajnalka and the supply depot at Naroka was not a famous road. It did not appear on most civilian maps. It was a narrow, unpaved track, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass each other without one pulling onto the verge, and it wound for approximately 19 kilometers through the deepest section of the WWII, one of the last great primeval forests in Europe, a place of 200-year-old oaks and impenetrable undergrowth, of bogs that had no bottom and shadows that did not move the way normal shadows moved. The Wehrmacht had chosen this road precisely because it was obscure. Supply convoys moving through the region preferred the forest track to the main roads, which were more likely to be observed by Soviet partisan scouts operating east of the forest. The logic seemed sound. The forest was vast and largely empty. German patrols moved through it regularly, and aside from a few incidents of sabotaged telephone wire, the route had proven reliable. That changed in the autumn of 1942. The supply column that vanished on November 14th was the 4th incident of its kind in 6 weeks. On October 3rd, a 3-vehicle patrol had failed to return from a routine reconnaissance near the village of Pobresols. Their vehicles were found 2 days later, parked in a clearing, engines cold, everything in order, and their 14 occupants nowhere to be found. On October 19th, a courier carrying orders from the regional command at Bialystok simply ceased to exist somewhere between kilometer markers 8 and 11 on the forest road. His motorcycle was recovered. He was not. On November 2nd, a 2-man bicycle patrol assigned to check the telephone line near the eastern edge of the forest returned to their post having seen nothing unusual, but the patrol that had preceded them by 40 minutes never came back at all. By the time Lieutenant Richter stood before the silent column on November 14th, the Wehrmacht garrison at Hajnalka was operating under a state of barely suppressed panic. The garrison commander, Major Heinrich Braun, was a methodical Bavarian who had served in France and in the early campaign in the Soviet Union. He had seen partisan attacks. He knew what ambushes looked like. He knew what mines looked like, what snipers left behind, what a firefight in a forest did to a column of men. And none of this looked like any of those things. Braun doubled the size of every patrol. He required all vehicles to travel in groups of no fewer than 5. He stationed observers at kilometer markers along the road, men with binoculars and radios, posted in pairs at the tops of the tallest trees. He requested 3 additional companies from the regional command to sweep the forest in a coordinated grid pattern. The sweep took 4 days and covered a substantial portion of the forest interior. It found a handful of animal carcasses, 2 abandoned farmsteads, several collapsed rabbit warrens, and nothing else. No partisans, no camps, no weapons caches, no missing men. Braun sat in his office on the evening of November 19th and wrote in his personal diary, a document later recovered by Soviet forces and eventually preserved in the State Archive at Warsaw, the following sentence: "I have fought in 3 countries, and I have never been afraid of an enemy I could see. I am afraid now, because whatever is doing this, we cannot see it at all." In the village of Hejnoka itself, the mood was different. The local population, Polish farmers, woodcutters, a few school teachers, and elderly pharmacists, received each report of another German disappearance with the same carefully neutral expression they had learned to wear in public. Their eyes did not change, their hands did not tremble. But in the evenings, gathered around single candles in back rooms with the curtains drawn tight, they spoke in urgent whispers about what they believed was happening and who they believed was responsible. The name they used was not yet spoken above a murmur. It was a name that had belonged 2 years before to an ordinary man. It had become something else entirely. Marta Kowalczyk was 53 years old in the autumn of 1942 and had lived in the same farmhouse on the western edge of the WWII forest for her entire life. She knew the forest the way most people know, the rooms of their own home, not with analysis or strategy, but with a deep automatic knowledge of a body moving through a familiar space. She knew which sections flooded in March and which ones stayed frozen until May. She knew where the wild boar nested and which trails they preferred at dusk. She knew the sound the forest made in a wind from the east and the different sound it made in a wind from the north. In late September of 1942, she noticed something that did not belong to any of those familiar sounds. It came at night, always between the hours of midnight and 3 in the morning. A low, rhythmic tapping. Not mechanical, not the sound of a woodpecker or a branch against a roof. More deliberate, more patient. It moved. It would begin somewhere to the northeast, near the old logging track, and then it would shift gradually until it was coming from the south, near the bog. It never came closer than perhaps a quarter of a kilometer from her farmhouse. But it moved with a consistency and purpose that told her it was not an animal. Her neighbor, Joseph Sawicki, a former forester in his late 60s, told her he had seen a figure in the trees on 2 separate occasions, once at dawn, once just before dark, each time at significant distance. He estimated 300 meters or more, and each time moving parallel to the forest road, not on the road, not crossing it, moving alongside it, inside the tree line, in a way that was slow enough to suggest deliberate patience and quiet enough that Sawicki had heard nothing at all. He only saw the figure because he happened to be looking in exactly the right direction at exactly the right moment. The figure, he said, was dressed in what appeared to be layers of cloth and pine branches. It was difficult to determine even the most basic physical details. It seemed to be carrying something on its back, a large bundle of some kind. It moved in a crouch. A third account came from a young boy named Paul Bartnick, 12 years old, who had been sent to fetch water from the creek north of the village on a gray October afternoon. He reported seeing, on the far bank of the creek, a man lying completely flat in the mud at the water's edge, perfectly still, face turned sideways, eyes open. The man was looking directly at him. Powell froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the man placed one finger against his lips. And then, in the time it took Powell to blink, the man was simply gone. Not running, not splashing through the creek, but gone as thoroughly as if the mud had swallowed him. Powell described the man as having dark eyes, a short dark beard, and a face so covered in dried mud and pine needles that it was nearly impossible to distinguish from the forest floor. He wore no uniform that the boy could identify. He carried a rifle on his back, its barrel wrapped in cloth. He was, Powell said with absolute certainty, not German. There were other accounts. A woman in the village of Teremiski reported hearing late one night the sound of something very heavy being moved through the undergrowth on the path behind her cottage, a dragging sound. Repetitive, rhythmic, sustained, over perhaps 20 minutes before it faded into silence. A woodcutter named Henryk Brzezowski, working alone in the eastern sector of the forest one gray November morning, found a section of road where the earth had been freshly disturbed, not dug exactly, but pressed, smoothed, and then covered over with leaves and broken branches in a pattern so careful it was nearly invisible. He stepped around it very slowly and did not tell the Germans what he had found. What all of these witnesses shared, what connected Marta Kowalczyk's nighttime tapping to Joseph Sawicki's glimpsed figure to Paul Bartnick's face in the mud, was a sense not of violence or menace, but of extraordinary, almost supernatural, patience. Whatever was moving through the Białowieża forest was in no hurry. It was waiting. It was watching. It was learning the forest and the road, and the German habits from the inside out, with the methodical calm of someone who had nothing to lose and all the time in the world, or rather, someone who understood precisely how much time he had and was using every second of it. To understand what happened on that forest road in the autumn and winter of 1942, it helps to first understand the terrain. The Białowieża forest is one of the most ecologically complex environments in Central Europe. Even today, large sections of its interior are designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a wilderness of old-growth trees, layered undergrowth, seasonal wetlands, and a forest floor so densely covered with roots, moss, and leaf litter that a person who knew what they were doing could move through it for kilometers without leaving a readable footprint. In 1942, the forest was even wilder than it is today, having been largely untouched since the interwar period when it served as a private hunting reserve. The German garrison at Hajnoka had two serious problems with the forest. First, it was too large to control. A complete perimeter required more men than the garrison had. Second, the forest's internal terrain was too varied and too dense for conventional search and destroy tactics. A sweep that found nothing did not mean there was nothing to find. It meant that whatever was there had simply moved. This is the first thing that any reconstruction of the operation must acknowledge. The person responsible for the disappearances was not operating from a fixed base. He had no camp in any permanent sense, no bunker, no underground shelter that a German search party could stumble across. He moved continuously, sleeping in different locations every day, sometimes in the canopy of a large oak, sometimes in the hollow of a fallen trunk, sometimes in a covered pit he had dug himself and could seal from the inside with a fitted frame of branches and moss. The preparation for each operation had begun weeks before it was carried out. The forest road between Hajnoka and Nerekwa ran through a corridor of particularly dense spruce trees for a stretch of approximately 4 kilometers, beginning at kilometer marker 7. It was in this section that most of the incidents occurred, and the reason was specific. The road curved 3 times in this stretch, and on each curve the sight lines were reduced to less than 80 meters in each direction. A driver approaching a bend could not see what was beyond it until he was already committed to the curve. Once into the bend, the forest closed in on both sides to within 5 meters of the road edge. The person responsible had mapped every one of these curves in precise detail. He had spent nights lying motionless beside the road, counting the vehicles that passed, timing their intervals, noting the patterns, how often a lead vehicle was followed by a second before the third, how long a column typically took to pass a given point, where drivers tended to slow down. He had done this for weeks before he acted once. The method he used for the October 3rd operation, the first incident, the one involving 3 vehicles and 14 soldiers, was a masterpiece of low-technology ingenuity. At a point on the road just before the second curve, in the pre-dawn darkness of an October morning, he laid a series of what military analysts would later call passive obstacles. Not mines, not tripwires, but a combination of carefully positioned wooden spikes in the road surface, covered in mud, and a set of log rollers placed under the gravel at the road's edge. The lead vehicle hit the spikes and suffered 2 simultaneous front tire punctures. Its momentum carried it sideways into the verge, where the log rollers caused the rear wheels to lose traction. The vehicle stopped at an angle across the road, blocking the path of the second truck. At this point, in the confusion of the stopped column, in the darkness, in the woods that pressed in from both sides, he struck. But not with weapons, not in any conventional sense. He had spent the previous night threading a series of thin wire lines between the trees on both sides of the road, at ankle height, at knee height, and at chest height, running back into the forest at angles that would be invisible in the darkness and confusion. When the soldiers climbed down from the trucks to assess the problem, they were moving in an environment that had been precisely engineered to redirect them. Noisemakers, tin cans with stones, positioned 40 meters into the tree line, drew their attention. Light signals, Small fires built of green pine boughs that produced thick smoke but very little flame, set at strategic points along pre-planned paths, confused their sense of direction. He moved through them, not fighting, not shooting, guiding. Each soldier, separated from his unit in the darkness and confusion, following sounds that seemed to indicate the position of his comrades, tracing the edge of a path he could barely see, found himself drawn deeper and deeper into the forest interior. The paths did not lead in circles. They led in specific directions, toward the bog, toward the deep section, toward the part of the forest where the terrain became a series of narrow islands separated by standing water, where a man without intimate local knowledge could walk for hours without making any forward progress. They were not killed. They were lost. By the time the morning light reached the forest floor and gave the disoriented soldiers enough visibility to attempt navigation, they had been moving through the forest for 3 to 4 hours in the wrong direction. They were between 4 and 7 kilometers from the road. Without compass headings, he had, it later emerged, removed the compasses from the vehicles before the operation began, and with no landmarks visible in the dense interior, they had no way of knowing which direction led back to civilization. Some of them were found, days later, by Soviet partisans operating east of the forest, exhausted and frostbitten but alive. Others were never found. Whether they died of exposure or were taken by Soviet forces or simply continued walking east and vanished into the occupied territories, no one has ever established with certainty. The ammunition and supplies left in the vehicles were a different matter. He returned to them before dawn, working alone and with extraordinary efficiency. He took what was useful, detonators, medical supplies, wire, tools, and disabled what was not, flooding the engines with water and removing the distributor caps. He concealed everything he took in a series of pre-dug cache pits spread across a wide section of the forest, each one located in a spot that he had memorized and could locate again without reference to any external marker. He then covered all traces of the operation with the same methodical patience that had characterized every step of the preparation. By the time Lieutenant Richter arrived at the silent column later that morning, the road itself was swept clean. The wire lines had been retrieved. The noisemakers were gone. The fires had been doused and the ash scattered. The only evidence that anything had happened was the disabled vehicles themselves and the absence of their crews. The subsequent operations followed the same basic template, with variations adapted to each specific target. The October 19th courier was diverted from his route by a hand-painted sign, indistinguishable in style and color from a genuine Wehrmacht directional marker that sent him down a forest track leading away from his destination. The track dead-ended after 3 kilometers in a flooded section of forest. The November 2nd patrol was separated from each other by a combination of carefully placed brush obstacles and a sustained series of bird call signals, sounds so natural that neither soldier registered them as anything other than the forest itself speaking. What unified all of these operations was not force, but psychology. The architect of these incidents was not trying to fight the German garrison. He was trying to make the forest itself into a weapon, to transform the landscape into something that worked against every instinct and assumption that his targets carried with them. He succeeded because he understood the forest from the inside in a way that no amount of training or military experience could replicate. And he understood the psychology of soldiers in an unfamiliar environment, the way darkness and disorientation compound each other, the way a man moving alone through an unknown forest at night will follow any sound that might be another human voice, will walk toward any light that might mean safety. He had spent his entire life in this forest. He knew exactly how it felt to be lost in it, and he knew, with the cold precision of long practice, exactly how to make someone feel that way. His full name was Alexander John Drost. He had been born in 1908 in the village of Pogausil, less than 4 kilometers from the edge of the WWII forest, the second of 4 children of a forester and his wife. His childhood was the forest. His father had taught him to track and trap before he could read, had walked him through every section of the protected reserve, had shown him the seasonal patterns of water and game and weather. By the time he was 20, Alexander Drost knew the WWII as few living people did, not as a place to visit or traverse, but as a place to inhabit, as naturally as breathing. He had trained formally as a forester in the late 1920s and taken a position with the Polish State Forestry Service in 1931. For nearly a decade he had worked as a district forester, responsible for a section of the protected reserve's interior. The work suited him completely. He was not a man of many words or large social gestures. He was quiet, observant, methodical, and possessed of a patience that his colleagues sometimes found difficult to distinguish from stubbornness. He knew the difference between a beech and a hornbeam at 100 meters. He could read a forest floor the way a doctor reads a face. He was, by all accounts of those who knew him, not a man born for war. The Germans arrived in the summer of 1941, following the launch of Operation Barbarossa, which pushed the front through eastern Poland at devastating speed. The occupation of the Białowieża region was swift and brutal. The Wehrmacht requisitioned food, livestock, and labor from the surrounding villages. The SS followed and began the systematic persecution of the region's Jewish population, gathered in the towns of Hednauka and Białystok, and transported east over the following months. Alexander Drost watched all of this. He watched it with the same still, careful attention that he gave to everything, the same quality of observation he brought to tracking a deer through winter snow or reading the first signs of a storm and the way the birds moved. In September 1941, the Germans came to his village of Pogorzelce. They were looking for labor. They took his younger brother, Tomasz, who was 30 years old and physically strong. Tomasz was transported to a work site near Brest. He was never heard from again. His wife and 2 children remained in the village. Something closed in Alexander Drost at that point. His colleagues and neighbors noticed it. He became even quieter than before. He stopped attending the church gatherings that the village organized on Sunday evenings. He worked his regular hours and then walked into the forest alone. Sometimes he did not come back until the following morning. In the spring of 1942, a German order required all forestry service employees to register with the new occupation administration and receive reassignment papers. Alexander Drost presented himself for registration on the required date, received his papers, and walked out of the garrison office at Hednauka. He returned to his quarters, packed a small bundle of personal items, his father's compass, a hunting knife, 2 changes of clothing, a worn copy of a Polish forestry manual, and walked into the forest. He did not come back out for 3 years. What Drost was doing in the months between his disappearance in the spring and the first incident in October was preparing. He was not impulsive, he was not reckless. He had a precise and thorough mind, and he understood something that professional soldiers often overlook, that the most effective form of resistance is the kind that the enemy cannot understand, because it does not look like resistance. It looks like the forest. He spent those months mapping, not with paper. Paper could be found, could be used against him. He mapped in his head, walking every section of the relevant terrain, memorizing the precise locations of every geographic feature that might be relevant to an operation. He cataloged the German patrol patterns by lying beside the road at night and counting vehicles. He identified the stretches of road where the sight lines were shortest, where the undergrowth was densest, where the boggy ground came closest to the road edge. He sourced his materials from what the forest and the abandoned farmsteads provided: wire from old fence lines, wood from fallen trees, cloth from a derelict barn. He fashioned camouflage from branches and mud, with the methodical skill of a man who had spent decades learning to move invisibly through natural terrain. He never carried more than he could run with. He never stayed in the same place 2 nights in succession. He operated entirely alone. He never contacted the village resistance networks, not because he distrusted them, but because he understood that any human connection was a vulnerability. Every person who knew his location was a thread that could be pulled. He pulled no threads. He left no threads. He left no threads. His motivation was not ideological in any complex sense. He did not write manifestos or deliver speeches. He was a man who had watched his brother taken and had made a decision that the forest, his forest, the place he understood more deeply than he understood anything else in the world, was not going to be a safe corridor for the people who had taken Tomasz. It was going to be the opposite. It was going to be the most dangerous place they had ever walked. The operations attributed to Alexander Drost continued through the winter of 1942 and into 1943. The German garrison at Hednauka, unable to identify the source of the incidents or develop any effective countermeasure, eventually rerouted all supply traffic to the main roads to the west, accepting the increased risk of Soviet partisan observation over the inexplicable dangers of the forest route. The road between Hednauka and Narikwa was effectively abandoned for military use by early spring 1943, a significant logistical concession, particularly given the strains of the broader Eastern Front campaign. Historians who have studied the period estimate that Drozd's operations between October 1942 and March 1943 disrupted the movement of more than 40 vehicles and contributed to the disorientation or disappearance of over 60 German soldiers, all without a single firefight, without any conventional weapon being fired in anger, and without Drozd himself ever being physically identified by any German patrol. He made contact with the Home Army, the Polish resistance organization known as the Armia Krajowa, in the spring of 1943. By that point, he had been operating in complete isolation for nearly a year, and his knowledge of the Białowieża terrain, the German patrol patterns, and the strategic use of the forest had become extraordinarily refined. He worked with the Armia Krajowa for the remainder of the occupation, training small groups of young resistance fighters in the techniques of camouflage, silent movement, and terrain manipulation that he had developed alone in the forest. His students later reported that he was a demanding but patient teacher. He spoke little. He demonstrated rather than explained. He had a habit of disappearing completely during training exercises, stepping sideways behind a tree and simply ceasing to exist, reappearing minutes later from an entirely unexpected direction, a demonstration that never failed to unsettle his students no matter how many times they had seen it. The war ended for Alexander Drost in the summer of 1944, when the Soviet advance swept through eastern Poland and the German occupation collapsed. He emerged from the forest in July of that year, thin and quiet, carrying his father's compass and the same hunting knife he had taken with him in 1942. He was 36 years old. The post-war years were difficult for him in ways that had nothing to do with injury or illness. Poland emerged from the German occupation into Soviet domination, and the Armia Krajowa veterans who had fought so hard against one occupier found themselves viewed with deep suspicion by the new political order. Drozd's wartime activities were known to people in the region, but he made no effort to publicize or formalize his record. He returned to forestry work, the same work he had always done, in the same forest he had always known. He never spoke about the war to outsiders. To those who knew him and occasionally pressed the question, he gave variations of the same answer, that he had done what the forest taught him to do, and that the forest had done the rest. He died in 1978 at the age of 70, having outlived the occupation, the Stalinist period, and most of the men who had known him during the war years. His official file with the Polish State Forestry Service listed his years of service without interruption, with a gap from spring 1942 to summer 1944, noted simply as absence, wartime circumstances. It was not until the opening of the Polish State Archives in the early 1990s that historians began to piece together the full picture of what had happened in the Białowieża forest during those years. The German records, Braun's diary, the incident reports, the garrison logs told one side of the story. Interviews with surviving elderly villagers from Hajnowoka and Polderzolz told another. And deep in the forest itself, and the handful of locations that local foresters still knew about if you asked the right questions, the cache pits were still there, long since emptied and softened by decades of growth. Their wooden frames rotted away, but their outlines still faintly visible as slight depressions in the forest floor. The forest remembered, even when the man who made it did not choose to speak. Alexander Drost has no monument. His name appears in a single footnote in a 2003 academic monograph on wartime resistance in the Białystok region and in the oral histories of a handful of families in the villages along the forest's edge. He did not seek recognition and did not receive it in any formal sense. What he did exists in the historical record mostly as a series of German reports describing things they could not explain, convoys that went silent, patrols that walked into the trees and did not come back, a forest that seemed, for a period of approximately 18 months, to have developed a will of its own. There is something fitting about that. Alexander Drost understood the Białowieża forest better than any military analyst or intelligence officer could. He understood that the most powerful weapon in any landscape is the landscape itself, that terrain, managed with patience and precision by someone who truly knows it, can accomplish what no number of soldiers or weapons can. He did not haunt the forest. He became part of it. And for a short, extraordinary period in the middle of the worst war in human history, a primeval forest in the heart of Eastern Europe held back an armored occupation, and the man responsible left no trace at all. That is the mark of a master. That the forest did not look like it had a master at all.